Harlem, 1948. Vinnie Moretti shoved Bumpy Johnson's pregnant wife on a crowded street. 24 hours later, Vinnie was still breathing, but he'd never walk straight again. Bumpy broke every bone below his neck, one by one, in front of his own crew. Why leave him alive to tell the story? Harlem, summer of 1948. The heat didn't just come from the sun, it rose from the concrete, from the basements where dice rattled against brick walls, from the back rooms where envelopes changed hands without a word. This was a city within a city, and it ran on rules nobody wrote down because everybody knew them. Women were off limits. Kids were sacred. Civilian blocks stayed clean. Break those rules, and you didn't get a warning, you got erased. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone. He'd built his empire on respect, not fear. Fear made men reckless. Respect made them careful. For 15 years, he'd kept Harlem balanced on that edge, and every player in the game knew where the lines were drawn. Until recently, the first sign came on a Tuesday night at the Cotton Club. Bumpy was sitting in his usual booth, watching the room like he always did, when he noticed a young guy in a sharp Italian suit collecting money from one of the card tables. The guy moved too confident, too loud, like he owned the place. Bumpy didn't recognize him, and that was the problem. In Harlem, you didn't operate without introduction. You didn't collect without permission. "Who's that?" Bumpy asked his lieutenant, a scarred veteran named Moses who'd been with him since the beginning. Moses leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "New crew out of Little Italy. They call him Vinnie Moretti. Been making noise for about 3 weeks now. Taking percentages from the numbers runners on 145th Street. Nobody stopped him yet." Bumpy's jaw tightened. Nobody asked him to stop either. "We were waiting to see what you wanted to do about it." That was the second problem. His own people were waiting instead of acting. That meant they were testing him too, watching to see if age had softened him. Bumpy was 42 now, and in this business, that made you either a legend or a target. Sometimes both. Over the next few days, Bumpy paid attention. He heard whispers in the barber shops, saw the way certain merchants looked over their shoulders when they counted their registers. Vinnie Moretti wasn't just collecting, he was claiming territory. He'd walk into establishments that had been under Bumpy's protection for a decade and act like the previous arrangements meant nothing. He'd stare too long at the wives of made men. He'd laugh too loud when their names came up. The air in Harlem changed. It got thicker, harder to breathe. The old-timers felt it first. They'd lived through enough wars to know when another one was coming. They started keeping their families inside after dark. They stopped talking business in public. The younger ones, the ones who'd only known peace, they didn't understand yet. They thought it was just another territorial dispute that would settle itself. But Bumpy knew better. This wasn't about territory. This was about respect. And respect was the only currency that mattered. On Saturday afternoon, Bumpy stood outside his apartment building on 139th Street, smoking a cigarette and watching the neighborhood. Kids played stickball in the street. Old women sat on stoops gossiping. Everything looked normal. But underneath, the foundation was cracking. Moses appeared beside him. "Moretti's crew hit another 2 spots last night. They're moving faster now." Bumpy took a long drag and exhaled slowly. "He's waiting for me to react. Wants to see how far he can push before I push back. So what do we do?" Bumpy dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his shoe. "Nothing. Not yet. Let him think he's winning. Power doesn't need to shout, but it always hears when someone steps on its ground." But even as he said it, Bumpy felt something shift in his chest. A cold certainty. This wasn't going to end with words. Thursday afternoon, Lenox Avenue, right in the heart of the shopping district where Harlem's respectable citizens did their business. This was neutral ground. No collections, no confrontations, no violence. The unwritten rule held firm here because everyone benefited from the peace. Mothers bought groceries. Merchants made sales. Life moved forward without fear. Bumpy's wife, Mamie, was 6 months pregnant with their first child. She'd spent the morning at the fabric store picking out material for baby clothes, humming to herself, one hand resting on her swollen belly. She was walking toward the butcher shop when she saw them 3 young men in expensive suits blocking the sidewalk ahead. Vinnie Moretti stood in the center, flanked by 2 guys built like brick walls. He was talking loud, gesturing with his hands, making sure everyone on the street could hear him, making sure everyone knew he existed. Mamie kept walking. She had no reason to stop. This was public space, broad daylight, witnesses everywhere. The old rules protected her here. As she approached, Vinnie's eyes locked onto her. He didn't move aside. His smile got wider. "Excuse me," Mamie said politely, trying to step around them. Vinnie shifted his weight, blocking her path. "You're Bumpy's woman, aren't you?" The street got quieter. People were watching now, pretending not to. "I need to get past," Mamie said, her voice steady but her hand instinctively moving to protect her stomach. Vinnie looked at his crew, then back at her. "Funny thing about accidents. They happen when you're not paying attention." He stepped closer, invading her space, close enough that she could smell the garlic on his breath and the expensive cologne that couldn't quite cover the stink of cheap cigars. "Please move," Mamie said. "Or what you gonna tell your husband?" Vinnie's grin turned ugly. Maybe he's not who people think he is anymore. Maybe he's just an old man who forgot how this game works. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but everyone who saw it would remember it for the rest of their lives. Vinnie's hand came up. Not a punch, not a slap, just a push. His palm connected with Mamie's shoulder, hard enough to make her stumble backward. Her heel caught the curb. She started to fall. A stranger, a young man carrying groceries, lunged forward and caught her before she hit the pavement. He lowered her down gently, his face pale with shock. The street erupted. Women screamed. Men started moving toward Vinnie, then stopped when his crew pulled back their jackets, showing the guns underneath. Mamie sat on the ground, tears streaming down her face, both hands clutching her belly. "The baby," she whispered. "Please, the baby." Vinnie stood over her, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, maybe fear, maybe regret. Then it vanished, replaced by cold calculation. "Accidents happen," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, especially to people who don't watch where they're going. He walked away, his crew following. Nobody stopped them. The young man who caught Mamie helped her to her feet. "Are you hurt? Should I get a doctor?" Mamie shook her head, but her eyes were focused on something else entirely. She wasn't looking at Vinnie's retreating back. She was looking at the faces around her witnesses. All of them. People who would talk. People who would tell Bumpy exactly what happened. "I didn't fall," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "I didn't fall." The old order hadn't collapsed, but someone had just put their hands on it, and now everyone was waiting to see what happened next. Not every push is meant to kill. Some are just meant to test what the other side will do about it. Harlem Hospital, 4:47 p.m. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Bumpy sat alone on a wooden bench, his hands clasped together so tight his knuckles had gone white. He hadn't said a word to anyone in over an hour. Moses stood guard by the door, turning away every concerned face that tried to enter. This was private. This was family. When the doctor finally emerged, Bumpy stood up so fast the bench scraped against the floor. The sound echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot. "Your wife is stable," the doctor said, removing his glasses to clean them, a nervous habit Bumpy recognized immediately. "The baby's heartbeat is strong. No signs of trauma. She was very lucky that young man caught her when he did." Bumpy's shoulders dropped half an inch. "Can I see her?" "She's resting now. But yes, you can go in. Room 304 down the hall on your left." The doctor walked away quickly, like he didn't want to be there when whatever came next started happening. Smart man. Bumpy found Mamie lying in a narrow hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Her hand rested on her belly, moving in slow circles. When she heard him enter, She turned her head, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not fear, not pain, but a cold, crystallized anger that made his blood run ice. "The baby's fine," she said before he could ask. "The doctors checked everything twice. We're both fine." Bumpy pulled a chair next to the bed and took her hand. "What happened out there, Moses told me bits and pieces, but I need to hear it from you." Mamie's jaw tightened. "It wasn't an accident. That's what I need you to understand. It wasn't some clumsy mistake or bad timing. He looked me right in the eyes and pushed me. He wanted me to fall. He wanted people to see it happen." "Who was he?" "Young guy, expensive suit, talked like he owned the whole damn street. Had 2 gorillas with him, both carrying guns under their jackets. They weren't even trying to hide it." Bumpy already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. "Did he say anything to you before he put his hands on you?" Mamie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word landed like a hammer. "He said maybe you're just an old man who forgot how this game works." Then he smiled at me like I was supposed to be grateful. He only pushed me instead of doing something worse. The room went silent. Even the sounds from the hallway seemed to fade away, like the whole hospital was holding its breath. "I didn't fall," Mamie continued, squeezing Bumpy's hand harder. "I need you to hear that. I didn't trip. I didn't lose my balance. He pushed me, and if that stranger hadn't caught me, I would have hit the concrete with our baby inside me. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Bumpy understood perfectly. This wasn't about money or territory or respect. This was a declaration. Vinnie Moretti had just announced to all of Harlem that the old rules meant nothing, that Bumpy Johnson's protection was worthless, that even his pregnant wife could be touched in broad daylight without consequence. Before Bumpy could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Moses stuck his head in. "There's someone here who says he needs to talk to you. Says it's important. Not now." He's the one who caught her. Bumpy looked at Mamie, who nodded. "Let him in. He deserves to hear thank you from both of us." The young man who entered was maybe 25, wearing a grocery store apron stained with what looked like tomato sauce. His hands shook slightly as he approached the bed. "I'm sorry to bother you folks," he said, his voice cracking with nerves. "I just wanted to make sure the lady was all right. I've been worried sick all afternoon." Bumpy stood and extended his hand. "You saved my wife and child. There aren't words big enough for that kind of debt." The young man shook his hand, then glanced nervously at the door like he was afraid someone might be listening. "There's something else you should know, Mr. Johnson. Something I heard after it happened. Go ahead." When that guy walked away, one of his friends asked him why he did it. Asked him if he was crazy putting his hands on your wife like that. The young man swallowed hard. He said it wasn't about her. He said it was about making you do something stupid in front of the whole city. He said once you break the rules publicly, everyone will know you're just like the rest of them, violent and desperate and out of control. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Mamie's grip on Bumpy's hand tightened. He's trying to force you into a war you can't win. He wants you angry. He wants you sloppy. Bumpy stared at the wall for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and colder than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "A man can lose money. A man can lose territory. A man can even lose a fight and walk away with his dignity intact. But no man alive can let himself be used as an example and still call himself a man." Everyone expected rage. They expected Bumpy Johnson to come out of that hospital like a hurricane. Guns blazing, bodies dropping in the street before sunrise. That's what young lions did when their pride got wounded. That's what desperate men did when they felt their power slipping away. But Bumpy didn't do what they expected. He did something worse. He went home. For 3 days, Harlem held its breath. Vinnie Moretti strutted through the streets like a peacock, collecting his percentages, making his jokes, waiting for the explosion that never came. His crew got bolder. They started showing up at establishments that had been under Bumpy's protection for decades, demanding tribute, daring anyone to refuse. "Where's your boss?" They'd ask the shopkeepers, "Where's the great Bumpy Johnson now?" hiding behind his pregnant wife's skirt. The old-timers stayed quiet, but their silence spoke volumes. They knew something the young ones didn't. They'd lived long enough to understand the difference between a man who was scared and a man who was thinking. On the fourth morning, Moses found Bumpy sitting in his kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper like it was any other day. No guns on the table, no maps of Little Italy spread out for planning an attack. Just a man having breakfast. "People are talking," Moses said carefully. "They're saying maybe we should hit back. Show them we're not soft." Bumpy folded the newspaper and set it aside. "Who's the young man who caught Mamie? The one from the grocery store?" Moses blinked at the change in subject. "Name's Calvin. Works at Morrison's Market on 143rd. Good kid. Keeps his head down. Stays out of trouble. I want you to find him today. Give him $500 and tell him it's from me. Tell him if he ever needs anything at all, he comes to me first. That's it. That's your response to what happened." Bumpy stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. "You know what Vinnie's mistake was? It wasn't putting his hands on my wife. It wasn't disrespecting me in public. Those were bold moves, calculated risks. Men have taken bigger gambles and won." Moses waited, sensing there was more coming. His mistake was thinking this was about him and me. Personal vendetta. Crime of passion. He wanted me angry because angry men make mistakes. Angry men start wars they can't finish. Angry men prove to everyone watching that they're exactly what their enemies say they are: violent, unstable. Yesterday's news trying to hold on to power through fear. "So we do nothing." Bumpy turned from the window, and Moses saw something in his eyes that made him take a step back. It wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous. Certainty. "I didn't say we do nothing. I said we don't do what he expects. Vinnie thinks he forced me into a corner. He thinks I either respond with violence and prove I'm a relic from a bloodier era, or I stay quiet and prove I'm weak. Either way, he wins." Bumpy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But he made one critical error in his calculations. "What's that?" "He did this in public, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. He wanted the whole city to see him disrespect me and walk away untouched. That means when I respond, the whole city is going to see that too. And what they see needs to send a message so clear, so undeniable, that nobody, not Vinnie, not his crew, not the next ambitious punk who thinks he can challenge the old ways, will ever forget it." Moses felt his mouth go dry. "What kind of message?" Bumpy picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. "The kind that doesn't require translation. You don't need to kill a man to destroy him. Sometimes letting him live is the cruelest thing you can do." "I don't understand." "You will. Get me everything you can find on Vinnie Moretti. Where he eats, where he sleeps, where he feels safest. I need to know his routine down to the minute." Moses nodded and headed for the door, then stopped. "Bumpy, this thing you're planning, is it going to start a war?" Bumpy stared out the window again, watching the neighborhood he'd protected for 15 years go about its morning business. Mothers walking their children to school. Old men sitting on stoops. Life continuing despite the violence simmering just below the surface. "No," he said finally. "It's going to end one. When power is forced to step into the light, someone has to pay the price to send it back into the shadows." Vinnie Moretti was about to learn that some debts can't be settled with money or apologies. They can only be paid in bone. Moses dropped the surveillance folder on Bumpy's kitchen table like it weighed 100 pounds. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, schedules mapped down to the minute everything they'd need to find Vinnie Moretti when he was most vulnerable. "Got everything you asked for," Moses said, pulling out a chair. The wood scraped against the floor, a sound like nails on a coffin lid. "Vinnie's routine is clockwork. Same streets, same times, same people around him. Makes him easy to track. Also makes him dangerous. He's surrounded by muscle 24/7. Bumpy opened the folder and studied the contents with the focused intensity of a surgeon planning an operation. Vinnie lived in a fortified brownstone on Mulberry Street. Always had at least 4 armed guards rotating shifts. He ate at Umberto's Clam House twice a week. Collected his weekly tribute at the Hester Street Social Club every Saturday afternoon, between 2 and 4 o'clock. Always with 6 soldiers flanking him like he was visiting royalty. Saturday, Bumpy said, his finger stabbing the surveillance photo of the social club. 2:30 in the afternoon. Right in the middle of his collection window when the place is packed with witnesses. Moses's eyes widened. You want to hit him during his own collection, when he's got his entire crew around him and the building's full of made men. That's exactly what I want. If I do this in some back alley at midnight, it's just another gang killing, another body that disappears, another mystery nobody solves. But if I walk into his club in broad daylight, in front of everyone he's trying to impress, then it becomes something else entirely. It becomes suicide, Moses said flatly. They'll cut us down before we get within 10 feet of him. Vinnie's got soldiers who've been killing people since before you and I were born. They're not going to just stand there while we beat their boss to death. Bumpy closed the folder and looked Moses dead in the eyes. I'm not going to kill him. That's the whole point. If I kill Vinnie, his crew has to respond. Honor demands it. They start a war. We start a war. Bodies pile up in the streets. And eventually the cops get involved because too much blood makes the politicians nervous. Everyone loses. So what's the play? Bumpy stood and walked to a closet in the corner. He pulled out a wooden cane, solid oak, thick as a man's wrist, polished, smooth from years of use. It was the same cane he'd carried when he first started building his empire, back when reputation meant nothing and respect had to be earned one broken jaw at a time. This is the only weapon I'm bringing, Bumpy said, gripping the cane so tight his knuckles went white. No guns, no knives, nothing that screams gang war or mob hit. Just this piece of wood and the absolute certainty that what I'm doing is righteous. Moses stared at the cane like it had just sprouted teeth. You're going to walk into a room full of armed killers with nothing but a stick. Not a stick. A statement. When I walk in there without a gun, I'm telling everyone in that room that this isn't about territory or money or power. This is about justice. This is about correcting a wrong so obvious, so undeniable, that even Vinnie's own crew will understand why it has to happen. And you think they'll just let you beat him? Just stand there and watch? Bumpy set the cane on the table between them. I think they'll be too shocked to move at first. By the time they process what's happening, I'll already be done with the parts that matter. And once they see what I'm doing, once they understand that I'm not trying to kill him, just destroy him, they'll realize that stopping me would be worse than letting me finish. Worse how? Because if they kill me to protect Vinnie, they're saying what he did was acceptable. They're saying it's okay to push pregnant women, to terrorize civilians, to break every rule that keeps our world from descending into complete chaos. And if they say that publicly, in front of witnesses, then every crew in the city will know the Italians have no code, no honor, no limits. Moses picked up the cane, testing its weight. It was heavier than it looked. Dense hardwood that could crack skulls like eggshells. This is insane. You know that, right? This whole plan is completely insane. Probably, Bumpy admitted, but it's the only play that ends without a war. Kill Vinnie, and his people have to respond. But break him, leave him alive but destroyed. That's not something they can avenge without looking like they're defending a man who put his hands on a pregnant woman. Nobody wants that smoke. What if you're wrong? What if they decide loyalty to their boss matters more than the code? Bumpy smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just cold calculation and the kind of certainty that comes from years of surviving in a world where one mistake gets you buried. Then we die in that room. But at least we die standing up, making a point that needed to be made, better than living on our knees, letting people think Bumpy Johnson's gone soft. Moses set the cane down and rubbed his face with both hands. When do we leave? Saturday morning? We'll get there right at 2:30, when the club's at maximum capacity. I want every soldier, every associate, every hanger-on to see what happens. I want the story to spread so fast and so far that by Sunday morning, every crew from Brooklyn to the Bronx knows exactly what the cost is for crossing the lines that should never be crossed. What do I tell the others? The whole crew's going to want to come with us. They're going to want to bring enough firepower to level that building. Bumpy shook his head. You tell them this is personal. You tell them that if I don't walk out of that club alive, they're free to burn Little Italy to the ground. But until then, they stay home and wait. This needs to be clean, precise. Just me delivering a message that can't be misunderstood. Moses stood to leave, then paused at the door. You really think this is going to work? You really believe they'll let you walk in there and tear their boss apart without lifting a finger to stop you? I believe that when a man walks into a room full of his enemies without a weapon and demands satisfaction for a wrong that everyone knows was committed, even his enemies will pause long enough to hear him out. And once I start making my case with this cane, once they see that I'm not here to kill but to correct, they'll understand that the real mistake would be stopping me. And if Vinnie dies anyway, if you hit him too hard and something breaks that can't be fixed, Bumpy's expression didn't change. Then I hit him too hard. But I won't. I've broken enough bones to know exactly how much force it takes to shatter without killing. Vinnie Moretti is going to live through this. He's going to live through every single second of it, every crack of breaking bone, every scream that tears out of his throat. That's not cruelty, that's the whole point. A dead man gets mourned for a week and forgotten within a month. A broken man gets suspended between breathing and dying for the rest of his miserable life. A living monument to what happens when you mistake patience for weakness, silence for surrender. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. Saturday afternoon, 2:28 p.m. Bumpy and Moses stood across the street from the Hester Street Social Club, watching the entrance like predators studying prey. Men filtered in and out, carrying envelopes thick with cash, conducting business in hushed tones, laughing at jokes that probably weren't funny. The whole operation ran smooth as clockwork collections, payments, bribes, all the machinery of organized crime humming along without friction. Vinnie had built something efficient here, something profitable. Shame it was about to collapse. Last chance, Moses said, his voice tight with tension. We could still call this off. Find another way to handle this that doesn't involve walking into a death trap armed with nothing but a goddamn stick. Bumpy adjusted his grip on the oak cane. No guns. No matter what happens in there, you keep your hands empty. Your only job is to watch my back and make sure nobody jumps me from behind. Can you do that? Yeah, I can do that. Then let's go. They crossed the street. Every step felt like walking through quicksand. The weight of what was about to happen pressing down on them like gravity had suddenly doubled. When they reached the door, Bumpy didn't knock, didn't announce himself, just pushed it open and stepped inside like he owned the place. The room went silent so fast it was like someone had cut the power to a radio. Conversations died mid-sentence. Card games froze with hands half played. Someone dropped a glass of whiskey, and it shattered on the floor in the sudden quiet. But nobody moved to clean it up. Every eye in the place turned toward the entrance, toward the two black men who'd just violated sacred ground without invitation. Vinnie Moretti sat at a corner table counting money with 3 of his lieutenants. Stacks of bills covered the surface 10s, 20s, hundreds, the weekly tribute from every operation under his control. He looked up slowly, and for just a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his face before transforming into something uglier. Amusement, contempt, the look of a man who thinks he's already won. Well, well, Vinnie said, setting down the cash he'd been counting. Bumpy Johnson, heard you were dead, or hiding. Couldn't figure out which rumor to believe. His crew laughed on cue, but the sound was forced, hollow. They could feel something wrong in the air. Something dangerous crackling like electricity before a lightning strike. Bumpy walked forward. The cane tapped against the floor with each step tappy-tap, a rhythm like a countdown to execution. The crowd parted without being asked. creating a path straight to Vinnie's table. Moses stayed by the door, hands visible, making it clear he wasn't there to fight. "You put your hands on my wife," Bumpy said. No preamble, no threats. Just a statement of fact delivered in a voice so calm it was absolutely terrifying. Vinnie leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms wide in mock innocence. Don't really remember that. Maybe she tripped. Maybe she's just clumsy. Pregnant women lose their balance sometimes. You know how it is. She didn't trip. You pushed her. Did it in public. In front of witnesses. Because you wanted me to react. You wanted me to come at you with an army. Start a war that would prove I'm just another desperate old man clinging to power. You wanted to show everyone that the rules don't matter anymore. That men like me are finished. Vinnie's smile faded slightly. So what, you gonna bore me to death with a speech that why you came here without your crew, without your guns? You think words are going to change anything? Bumpy stopped 3 feet from the table, close enough to see the confidence in Vinnie's eyes, close enough to watch that confidence shatter. I came here to give you something you didn't give my wife, a chance to understand what's about to happen and why. One of Vinnie's lieutenants, a thick-necked enforcer with scar tissue for knuckles, stood up fast, his hand moving toward the gun under his jacket. "Boss, you want me to throw this old fuck out on his ass?" "Sit down, Tony," Vinnie said, waving him off dismissively. "I want to hear what he has to say. This should be entertaining." But his eyes told a different story. He was calculating now, trying to figure out the angle. Why would Bumpy Johnson walk into enemy territory alone? What was the play here? "Your mistake wasn't disrespecting me," Bumpy continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the kind of quiet that makes everyone strain to listen. "Your mistake wasn't even putting your hands on a pregnant woman in the middle of the day. Your mistake was forcing me to respond publicly. You made this about reputation. You made it so the whole city is watching to see what I do next. And that means what happens now isn't personal revenge. It's structural correction." Vinnie laughed, but it sounded forced. "You came here to lecture me about structure, about rules and reputation. Old man, I make my own rules now. This is my city, my operation, The cane came down before he could finish the sentence. It hit Vinnie's left hand with a crack like a rifle shot. Bones shattered, instantly metacarpals, phalanges, the delicate architecture of the human hand collapsing under focused violence. Vinnie's scream tore through the room, raw and animal and completely devoid of the cocky confidence he'd been wearing like armor. His crew jumped to their feet, hands reaching for weapons. A dozen guns started to clear holsters. "Don't," Moses said from the doorway, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Look at his hands. He's not holding a gun. Neither am I. If you shoot us, you're murderers killing unarmed men. But if you let him finish, you're just witnesses to justice being served." The guns stopped moving. Didn't holster, but didn't clear either. Frozen in that terrible moment between action and restraint. Vinnie tried to pull his hand away, but Bumpy was faster. The cane came down again, this time on the right hand. Another crack. Another scream. Vinnie's face went white with shock and pain, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. "This is for my wife," Bumpy said quietly, almost conversationally. "This is for my unborn child. This is for every woman in this city who should be able to walk down the street without fear that some ambitious punk will use her as a message." The cane rose and fell with mechanical precision, ribs next 3 sharp strikes that fractured bone without puncturing organs. Bumpy had done this enough times to know exactly how hard to hit, exactly where to aim. The science of causing maximum pain without causing death. Vinnie collapsed out of his chair, writhing on the floor, his screams dissolving into helpless sobbing. His crew stood frozen, caught between loyalty and self-preservation, between the code that said protect your boss and the deeper code that said some violations demand consequences. Bumpy stood over Vinnie's broken body, the cane still in his hand, not even breathing hard. "You're going to live through this," he said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. You're going to wake up every morning in pain and remember exactly why. And everyone who sees you limping through the streets with your broken hands and your scarred face will remember too. That's the price for crossing lines that should never be crossed. He turned and walked toward the door. Moses fell in beside him. The crowd parted again, creating a path to the exit. Nobody stopped them. Nobody even moved. Because real power doesn't need to finish the job. It just needs to make sure nobody ever makes the same mistake again. By Sunday morning, every corner of Harlem was buzzing with the story. Not in newspapers, there would never be newspapers. Not in police reports, the cops knew better than to get involved in something that didn't concern them. The story spread the old way. The real way through whispers in barber shops, hushed conversations in church pews, urgent phone calls between men who needed to know which way the wind was blowing. I heard Bumpy walked into that Italian club with nothing but a cane. One man said, leaning over his bourbon at the Cotton Club. No guns, no crew. Just walked in like he was delivering a telegram. That's not even the crazy part. Another replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The crazy part is what he did when he got there. Beat Vinnie Moretti so bad the kid's own mother couldn't recognize him. Broke both his hands first, finger by finger, so he couldn't fight back. Then went to work on his ribs, his face, his legs. Made it last almost 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Jesus Christ. And Vinnie's crew just stood there. Had their guns on them, everyone saw the bulges under their jackets, but nobody drew. Nobody moved. They just watched their boss get dismantled like a broken clock, piece by screaming piece. The stories multiplied and evolved as they spread, each retelling adding new details, new horrors, new lessons. Some said Bumpy broke 30 bones. Others said 40. One particularly dramatic version claimed he'd crushed Vinnie's kneecap so thoroughly the kid would never walk without a cane for the rest of his life. The exact numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the message underneath all the variations. Bumpy Johnson had walked into enemy territory in broad daylight and delivered a beating so savage, so methodical, so utterly devoid of mercy that grown men who witnessed it couldn't eat properly for days afterward. Their stomachs turned every time they remembered the sounds, the crack of breaking bones, the wet thud of wood against flesh. Vinnie's screams that started out loud and defiant, but gradually dissolved into helpless whimpering. In Little Italy, the Italian families held emergency council. Bosses from all 5 boroughs gathered in a smoke-filled restaurant basement to discuss the implications. This wasn't just about one punk kid getting what he deserved. This was about territorial integrity, about respect between organizations, about whether they could let a black gangster walk into an Italian social club and walk out alive after committing such brutal violence. We have to respond, one of the younger bosses argued, slamming his fist on the table. If we let this stand, every crew in the city is going to think they can do whatever they want on our turf. We'll look weak. We'll look scared. The older boss at the head of the table, a man named Genovese, who'd been running operations since before most of them were born, shook his head slowly. You're thinking about this wrong. You're thinking about territory and pride. But that's not what this is about. Then what is it about? It's about rules. The kid put his hands on a pregnant woman, Bumpy's pregnant wife, in public, with witnesses everywhere. He didn't just disrespect one man. He violated the code that keeps all of us in business. Women are off limits. Children are off limits. Families are off limits. Those aren't Bumpy's rules or our rules. Those are the rules that separate us from animals. Another boss leaned forward. So we're just going to let this go. Let Bumpy beat one of our guys half to death and pretend it never happened. We're going to recognize it for what it was: justice. Brutal, ugly justice, but justice nonetheless. Vinnie broke the rules first. He started this, and Bumpy finished it in the only way that makes sense in our world. He didn't kill the kid because killing him would have started a war. He broke him instead, made him a living example. That takes more discipline than pulling a trigger. That takes calculation. The room fell silent. Nobody wanted to admit it, But they all understood the logic. If they retaliated against Bumpy for what he did to Vinnie, they'd be defending the indefensible. They'd be saying it was acceptable to target pregnant women, to terrorize civilians, to drag the underworld's violence into spaces that were supposed to remain neutral. So what do? Someone finally asked. Genovese lit a cigar and exhaled slowly. We pull our people out of Harlem. Quietly. No announcements. No explanations. We just stop operating there. We let Bumpy have his territory back without contest. And we make sure every soldier in our organization understands why we're doing it, because Vinnie fucked up. And the price for that fuck-up has already been paid in blood and bone. Within 48 hours, the Italian presence in Harlem evaporated like morning mist. The collection crews stopped showing up. The muscle that had been intimidating shopkeepers disappeared overnight. The young punks who'd been testing boundaries suddenly found other neighborhoods to terrorize, other territories to claim. The Harlem shopkeepers noticed immediately. Mr. Chen, who ran a laundry on 145th Street, had been paying protection money to 3 different crews for the past month. Now, suddenly, only Bumpy's people came around, and their collection was reasonable, predictable, part of the established order. What happened? Chen asked Moses when he came by for the weekly envelope. Moses just smiled. The city remembered how things are supposed to work. That's all. At Morrison's Market, young Calvin was restocking shelves when his boss pulled him aside. That envelope Bumpy left for you. The $500. Calvin nodded nervously. Word is, he's doing that all over the neighborhood. Finding people who helped during the incident. People who did the right thing when it mattered. Rewarding them. Showing everyone that standing up for what's right doesn't just get you respect. It gets you taken care of. Calvin thought about the money hidden under his mattress at home. Enough to pay off his mother's medical bills. Enough to finally propose to his girlfriend. Enough to prove that doing good could lead to good things, even in a world as dark and complicated as this one. By the end of the week, Harlem felt different. The air was cleaner somehow. Lighter. Parents let their kids play outside after dark again. Old women sat on their stoops without fear. The neighborhood exhaled collectively, releasing tension it hadn't even realized it was holding. Nobody needed official explanations or press conferences. Nobody needed police investigations or court proceedings. The city understood what had happened and why. A line had been crossed. A correction had been administered. Balance had been restored. The silence itself was the explanation. And in that silence, Harlem rebuilt itself stronger than before. Vinnie Moretti spent 3 weeks in St. Vincent's Hospital. The doctors worked miracles just keeping him alive. His injuries were that severe. Both hands completely shattered, requiring multiple surgeries and metal pins to reconstruct. 7 ribs fractured or broken entirely, one of which had come dangerously close to puncturing his lung. His face required 63 stitches, leaving scars that would mark him forever as the man stupid enough to push Bumpy Johnson's pregnant wife. But physical injuries heal. Eventually. The real damage was deeper, more permanent, carved into his psyche like initials in wet concrete. His crew visited exactly once. They shuffled into his hospital room like mourners at a funeral, faces carefully neutral, eyes avoiding direct contact. They brought flowers, carnations, because nobody thought to buy anything nicer, and stood awkwardly around his bed while he lay there, bandaged and broken, staring at the ceiling. "How you feeling, boss?" his top lieutenant asked, the word boss sounding hollow and obligatory. Vinnie tried to answer, but talking hurt his fractured ribs. "Like I got hit by a truck," he finally managed, his voice barely above a rasp. "Yeah, well," the lieutenant trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, we've been talking about the business. About how to move forward." Vinnie knew what was coming. He'd known since the moment he woke up in this bed and realized none of them had visited for the first 2 days. They'd been waiting to see if he'd die, Because dead bosses were easier to replace than living embarrassments. We think it's best if you take some time to recover. Really focus on healing. Don't worry about the operation. We'll handle collections, manage the territories, keep everything running smooth until you're back on your feet. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. They weren't going to hold his position for him. They were going to divide it up among themselves and pretend he'd never existed. By the time he got out of this hospital, there wouldn't be an organization for him to return to, just fragments scattered among ambitious men who'd learned the most important lesson of all. Never fuck with Bumpy Johnson's family. Get out, Vinnie said, each word costing him pain. They left quickly, relief evident on their faces. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid sealing shut. The weeks became months. Vinnie was discharged with a cane he'd need for the rest of his life, bottles of pills that barely touched the pain, and instructions to return for physical therapy 3 times a week. He moved back into his brownstone on Mulberry Street, the same place where just months ago he'd counted money and made plans for expanding his empire. Now the house felt like a mausoleum. Every room echoed with memories of who he used to be: confident, powerful, untouchable. That person was dead. In his place was this broken thing that could barely dress itself in the morning, whose hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling. The worst part wasn't the pain, though that was constant and excruciating. The worst part was seeing his reflection. The scars on his face told a story he couldn't escape. Everyone who looked at him knew exactly what had happened, exactly what he'd done to deserve it. Young guys in the neighborhood started pointing him out to each other. See that guy? That's Vinnie Moretti. Used to be somebody. Then he pushed Bumpy Johnson's pregnant wife and got himself destroyed. Now he's nothing. Just a warning sign with a pulse. Vinnie heard these conversations more often than he wanted to admit. He'd be buying groceries or picking up his medication, and he'd catch fragments of whispers, see young men nudging each other and staring. He'd become a cautionary tale, a boogeyman story mothers told their sons. Don't be like Vinnie. Don't let ambition outpace your common sense. Don't touch what doesn't belong to you. His mother visited every Sunday, bringing homemade pasta and desperate optimism. You could leave, she'd say, wringing her hands. Go to California. Start fresh where nobody knows your face. You're still young, Vincent. You still have time to build a new life. But Vinnie never left. Maybe he was too proud. Maybe he was too broken. Maybe. On some level he couldn't quite articulate. He understood that geography wouldn't solve his problem. The real prison wasn't New York. It was his own body, his own memory, his own complete understanding of how catastrophically he'd miscalculated. He'd thought he was testing Bumpy's limits, proving to everyone that the old guard was finished. Instead, he'd proved the opposite. He'd demonstrated that the old rules still held, that boundaries still mattered, that some lines existed for very good reasons. At night, when the pain medication wore off and sleep became impossible, Vinnie would replay that Saturday afternoon in obsessive detail. He'd see Bumpy walking through the door, see the cane rising and falling, hear his own screams echoing off the walls, watch his crew standing frozen, unable or unwilling to intervene. The question that haunted him most wasn't why Bumpy had been so brutal. It was why his own people had let it happen, why they'd stood there like statues while their boss got dismantled. The answer was obvious but unbearable because he'd deserved it, because he'd violated rules that kept everyone safe, because saving him would have meant defending the indefensible. Years passed. Vinnie's hair went gray prematurely. His hands never stopped shaking. The pain never fully went away. He lived in that brownstone like a ghost haunting his own life, watching the world move forward while he remained stuck in that moment when everything went wrong. Other young guys came up in the neighborhood, ambitious and hungry just like he'd been. Some of them made the same mistakes, pushed too hard, crossed the wrong lines, underestimated the men who'd built this city's underworld. Most of them ended up dead or in prison. But occasionally, when one of these young lions started getting too confident, too reckless, the old-timers would take them aside and say, "You see that guy with the cane, the one with the scars? That's what happens when you forget that some men earned their reputation for a reason. Learn from his mistake, or become the next one." Vinnie Moretti lived for 37 more years after that Saturday afternoon. But the person he'd been ambitious, powerful, fearless died in the Hester Street Social Club and never came back. Some men get bullets and graves and obituaries that remember them as they were. Vinnie got something far crueler. He got to survive as a breathing monument to the price of crossing lines that were never meant to be tested. 3 months after the beating, Mamie Johnson gave birth to a healthy baby girl in the same hospital where Bumpy had waited to learn if his wife and unborn child would survive Vinnie's attack. They named her Margaret, and when Bumpy held his daughter for the first time, he understood with perfect clarity why he'd done what he'd done in that social club. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about pride or territory or maintaining his reputation. This was about creating a world where his daughter could grow up without fear, where the rules meant something, where violence stayed contained to the people who'd chosen this life instead of spilling into the streets where innocent people lived. "She's perfect," Mamie whispered from the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. "She's going to grow up strong, like her father." Gee, Bumpy looked down at his daughter's tiny face and felt something shift in his chest. "No," he said quietly. "She's going to grow up safe. That's better than strong." Moses stood by the window, watching Harlem through the glass. The city looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. Business was good again. The streets were clean. Families walked without looking over their shoulders. The delicate balance between crime and community had been restored. "You did it," Moses said. "You brought everything back to how it's supposed to be." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "I bought us time, that's all. 5 years. Maybe 10 if we're lucky. Eventually, some other ambitious kid is going to decide he's smarter than everyone who came before him. He'll test the boundaries, push the limits, see how far he can go before someone stops him. It's the nature of power. Every generation thinks they invented it. And when that happens, someone will have to teach the lesson again. Might be me, might be someone else. But the lesson will get taught because it always has to be taught." Bumpy looked at his daughter, sleeping peacefully in his arms. That's the price of maintaining order. It's not something you pay once and forget about. It's a debt that comes due every time someone forgets why the rules exist. Over the following weeks, Harlem settled into a new normal that looked remarkably like the old normal. Bumpy's organization resumed its operations without interference. The Italian families stayed in their own territories, respecting boundaries that had been redrawn in blood and bone. The police continued their careful dance of looking the other way when it benefited them and cracking down when political pressure demanded it. But something had changed fundamentally. The younger generation, the ones who'd grown up during peacetime and never understood why certain rules were sacred, had learned a valuable lesson. They'd seen what happened when someone violated the code. They'd watched Vinnie Moretti go from rising star to broken cautionary tale in the span of 20 minutes. Calvin, the young man from the grocery store, used Bumpy's gift to transform his life. He paid off his mother's medical bills, married his girlfriend in a small ceremony at St. Philip's Church, and eventually opened his own market in a neighborhood that desperately needed one. Every week, he sent a portion of his profits to Bumpy, not as protection money, but as gratitude. And every week, Bumpy sent it back with a note: "Keep it. Build something good." The story of what happened in the Hester Street Social Club became legend. Parents told it to their children as a warning about respecting boundaries. Criminals told it to each other as a reminder that some men's reputations were earned through action, not talk. Even cops told it in their precincts as an example of how the underworld policed itself when official justice failed. But the story changed in each retelling. Facts blending with fiction, until nobody could quite remember what was real and what was embellishment. Some versions had Bumpy breaking 50 bones. Others said he'd used a baseball bat instead of a cane. One particularly dramatic account claimed he'd made Vinnie's crew hold their boss down while he administered the beating. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the core truth. Underneath all the variations, touch what doesn't belong to you. Violate the sacred rules, and someone will make you pay a price that makes death look like mercy. Bumpy never spoke about that afternoon. When people asked, and they did ask, constantly he'd just shake his head and change the subject. There was no pride in what he'd done, no satisfaction in the brutality he'd committed. It had been necessary, like amputating a gangrenous limb to save the body. Necessary, but not something to celebrate. On Margaret's first birthday, Bumpy threw a party that filled their entire apartment building. Neighbors brought food, friends brought gifts, and for a few hours, everyone forgot about the violence and darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their world. They celebrated life and hope and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the next generation would find a better way. Late that night, after the guests had left and Mamie had put Margaret to bed, Bumpy stood on their fire escape and smoked a cigarette. He thought about Vinnie Moretti, probably sitting in his brownstone at this exact moment, hands shaking, scars aching, living with the permanent consequences of one catastrophic mistake. He thought about all the other young men who'd tested him over the years, some of whom had learned their lesson, and some of whom were now buried in unmarked graves. He thought about the endless cycle of ambition and correction, violence and order, chaos and control that defined his world. Most of all, he thought about his daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, completely unaware of what her father had done to ensure she'd grow up in a neighborhood where the rules still meant something. She'd never know the details. She'd never understand the calculations he'd made or the price he'd paid. And that was exactly how it should be. Children shouldn't have to know what monsters their parents become to protect them from other monsters. Bumpy finished his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of the order he'd fought so hard to maintain. But tonight, his family was safe. His neighborhood was peaceful. The boundaries were clear and respected. In this world, silence is a choice. Inaction is a strategy. But when someone crosses the line that should never be crossed, when they force your hand by targeting the innocent, then silence becomes complicity and inaction becomes surrender. Bumpy Johnson had refused to surrender. He'd stepped into the light, administered brutal justice in front of witnesses, and sent a message so clear that it echoed through the entire city. Some rules are written in blood, but the most important ones are carved in bone. Order only exists when someone is willing to defend it. Peace only lasts when people remember what happens when they break it. And in Harlem, 1948, everyone remembered. The city slept. The streets quieted. And somewhere in Little Italy, Vinnie Moretti lay awake in pain, a living reminder that in this world, there are fates worse than death. Some men get bullets. Some men get graves. Some men get to live with their mistakes until those mistakes become their entire identity. Vinnie got option 3, and everyone who knew his story understood that was the cruelest punishment of all. Vinnie Moretti survived 37 more years, but the man who shoved a pregnant woman died in that social club. His broken hands never healed right, every tremor, every ache, a permanent reminder. Bumpy never mentioned that afternoon again. Didn't need to. The whole city understood cross certain lines, and death becomes mercy. What Bumpy gave Vinnie was worse decades of waking up crippled, watching young punks whisper his name as a warning. If this story gave you chills, smash that subscribe button. Drop a comment. What would you have done?